My stepmother and father abandoned me, and I did something they could not have expected. Hello, read it. I've heard people say that family is unconditional, that no matter what happens, the bond you share with your blood ties you together. For a long time, I believed that too. My name is Daniel. I'm 28 years old, and I've spent most of my life convincing myself that I was part of something permanent, something unshakable. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't about blood or bonds. Family is about who chooses you. 6 years ago, my father remarried. It was a quiet ceremony, just close friends and family. I remember standing in the back of the room, watching him beam at his new bride, Celeste, like he had just won the lottery. It had been 5 years since my mom passed, a brutal, drawn-out battle with cancer that left us both hollowed out. I don't think my dad ever recovered from it. Not fully. He was a ghost for years after her death, going through the motions, existing without really living. So when Celeste came into the picture, I wanted to believe she was good for him. Celeste was everything my father wasn't. Vibrant, charming, full of life. She lit up every room she walked into, and people couldn't help but gravitate toward her. She had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Lily and Grace, who were 8 years old at the time. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect blended family. I even thought so at first. But cracks started to show before the ink on their marriage license was even dry. Celeste was polite to me, but never warm. She had this way of smiling at me that felt more like a performance than genuine affection, like she was checking off a box on her to-do list. And the twins, well, they were just kids. They were bubbly, sweet, and full of energy, but I couldn't help feeling like an outsider even back then. I tried my best to make it work. I helped them with their homework, played video games with them, and showed up to their school plays like a good older brother should. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. Celeste never explicitly said it, but her actions spoke louder than words. She redecorated the house within months of moving in, erasing every trace of my mom's presence. The warm, homey vibe my mom had so carefully created was replaced with sterile, catalog-perfect furniture that made the house feel more like a showroom than a home. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. It was just furniture, just wallpaper, just curtains. But those little changes were like the first drops of rain before a storm. Slowly, I started to notice other things. The way my father would defer to Celeste on everything, even when it came to decisions about me. The way family dinners started feeling more like performances, with me sitting at the edge of the table like an audience member instead of a participant. The way my birthday went unnoticed 2 years in a row, despite the fact that I never forgot Lily and Grace's. By the time I was 26, I had come to terms with the fact that I was no longer a priority in my father's life. I told myself it was fine, that I was an adult and didn't need to be the center of anyone's world. But the truth is, it hurt more than I was willing to admit. I was still his son. I was still here. Didn't that count for something? Then came the honeymoon announcement. It was a week ago. My father called a family meeting, which was already unusual. We rarely sat down together unless it was for holidays, and even then it always felt forced. I joined them in the living room, trying not to let my irritation show. Celeste was perched on the edge of the couch, all smiles, with Lily and Grace giggling next to her. My father stood awkwardly by the fireplace, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure how to start. "We've got some exciting news," he finally said, looking at Celeste for reassurance. "We're going on a honeymoon." I remember the way my heart sank at those words, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way Celeste beamed like she had won some grand prize. Or maybe it was the way my father avoided looking directly at me. "All 4 of us," Celeste added, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. "It's been years in the making, and we figured it's finally time to take a proper family trip. Isn't that exciting? A proper family trip." The words hit me like a slap. I glanced at Lily and Grace, who were practically bouncing with excitement. It was clear they had already known about the trip, maybe even helped plan it. And me? I was an afterthought. Celeste turned to me with that same practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "You'll hold down the fort while we're gone, won't you, Daniel? You're so responsible. We're lucky to have you." Responsible. That was the word they always used when they wanted me to stay out of the way. It was their way of patting me on the head and saying, "Good boy," while they went off to live their lives without me. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? The morning they left, I stood by the front door, watching as they loaded their suitcases into the car. My father muttered something about locking the doors and checking the mail, as if I were some kind of housekeeper. Celeste handed me a printed list of reminders, her tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. Lily and Grace didn't even acknowledge me. They were too busy arguing over who got the window seat on the plane. I watched as the car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, leaving me alone in the empty house. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the silence they left behind. It wasn't anger I felt, not exactly. It was something colder, sharper, a quiet, simmering resentment that had been building for years. I thought about all the times I had tried to make this family work, all the times I had swallowed my pride and convinced myself that things would get better. But they hadn't. And now, standing in that empty house, I realized they never would. If they didn't see me as part of their family, then maybe it was time I stopped seeing them as mine. They had built this life without me, and now they were off to enjoy it. But when they came back, they'd find out just how much of a mistake that choice was. Because I wasn't going to let them come back. Not into my house. The silence of the house was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace or rest. It was the kind that reminded you just how empty a space could feel when no one wanted you in it. I stood in the foyer for a long time after they left, clutching the list Celeste had handed me like some cruel joke. A reminder of my place, of the expectations they had for me. Keep things running, keep things clean, and keep myself invisible. I crumpled the list and tossed it onto the floor. It felt good, defiant even, but the satisfaction was fleeting. The weight of their absence pressed down on me, heavier than I expected. It wasn't just the act of being left behind. It was what it represented. This wasn't an oversight, an accidental slight. No, this was intentional. A deliberate decision to exclude me from their family, to leave me in the dust while they moved on to a life I was never meant to be part of. I wandered through the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. It didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time, but now the feeling was impossible to ignore. Every corner of it was a reminder of how much I'd been pushed aside. The furniture was sleek and modern, chosen by Celeste to fit her aesthetic. The photos on the walls were carefully curated. Snapshots of her and my father smiling on vacation, the twins posing with trophies and medals, all carefully arranged to tell the story of a happy, blended family. But there was nothing of me. No trace of the life my father and I had before Celeste arrived. No photos of my mom. No evidence that I even existed in this house. It was as if I'd been erased, a ghost haunting a space that used to be mine. I walked into the living room, my eyes falling on the centerpiece of it all, the massive sectional couch they'd bought last year. I remembered how Celeste had gushed about it, saying it was perfect for family movie nights. I could still hear her voice, bubbly and insistent, as she described the nights they'd spend curled up together watching their favorite films. But I wasn't part of those nights. I never was. The anger that had been simmering in me all morning began to bubble to the surface. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold, quiet, and deliberate. It was the kind of anger that didn't just demand action, but required it. This was my house. My name was on the deed, along with my father's. When my mom passed, she left everything to him and me. But slowly, over the years, Celeste had made it hers. She'd changed the furniture, replaced the dishes, painted the walls. Everything was hers now. And my father let it happen. He gave her the reins, gave her the power, and left me standing on the sidelines. But I wasn't going to stand on the sidelines anymore. The idea came to me slowly at first, like a seed planted in the back of my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more it grew, taking root and spreading until it consumed every other thought. If they didn't see me as part of this family, then why should I see them as part of my life? If they could so easily erase me, then maybe it was time I erased them. Not out of existence, of course, but out of this house, this space that used to belong to me and my mom. I spent the rest of the day pacing through the house, my mind racing with possibilities. It was an odd, almost surreal feeling, knowing I had the power to change everything. They were gone, far away on some tropical beach, blissfully unaware of what was brewing back home. I pictured them lounging in the sun, sipping drinks with little umbrellas, completely unconcerned about the house or me. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. They didn't deserve this house. They didn't deserve to come back to the life they had built on the foundation of everything I had lost. My mom's memory, my place in the family, it was all sacrificed so they could have their perfect, picturesque life. I started small. The first thing I did was gather the photos from the walls. Every smiling portrait, every candid shot of them laughing and celebrating, every reminder of their so-called family. I took them down one by one until the walls were bare. I piled them on the dining table, staring at the heap of frames that once told the story of a life I wasn't part of. Next, I went to the storage room. My mom's things were still there, tucked away in boxes like they didn't matter. Her books, her trinkets, the little pieces of her life that Celeste deemed unimportant. They were all there, collecting dust. I started pulling them out, one by one, laying them out in the living room. It was cathartic, like I was reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. As the day stretched into evening, the house began to feel different. The sterile, impersonal atmosphere Celeste had created was fading, replaced by something warmer, something familiar. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. I sat in the living room that night, surrounded by my mom's things, staring at the empty walls where their photos used to hang. The silence didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt peaceful. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. But I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. They thought they could come back to this house, pick up where they left off, and carry on as if I didn't exist. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them walk back into my life like nothing had happened. This was my house, my life, and I was finally taking it back. By the time they returned, everything would be different, and they wouldn't be welcome here anymore. As the days passed, I began to see the house in a new light. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a monument to every slight, every insult, every dismissal I had endured. The pristine furniture, the neutral gray walls, the spotless glass coffee table. All of it was a stage Celeste had carefully designed, stripping away any trace of the life my mother and I had once built here. The house was hers now, or at least she thought it was. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of her control. The master bedroom, which once held the comforting warmth of my parents' shared life, was now a cold, minimalist shrine to Celeste's idea of perfection. The kitchen, where my mom used to bake every Sunday, smelled faintly of artificial lavender, Celeste's signature spray. Even the backyard, where my dad and I had once built a treehouse together, was transformed into a sterile patio with sleek furniture and decorative stones that no one ever used. I realized something disturbing about myself during those quiet, solitary days. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was vengeful. It wasn't enough for them to come back and find a locked door or a messy house. That would be too simple, too easy to recover from. No, I wanted them to feel what I felt. That deep, gnawing sense of displacement, that undeniable realization that their home, their sanctuary, was no longer theirs. The plan I had begun to piece together wasn't just about the house. It was about erasing them from it entirely the way they had erased me. The first thing I did was tackle the closets. Celeste loved her designer clothes. Rows of blouses, dresses, and perfectly coordinated scarves hung in the master bedroom closet like soldiers in formation. I started with those. One by one, I pulled them from their hangers, folded them neatly, and carried them to the garage. From there, they went into boxes, sealed and labeled with a single word, donate. Lily and Grace's room came next. It was a pink explosion of trendy decor and mismatched clutter. Posters of their favorite bands covered the walls, and the bed was buried under piles of stuffed animals and throw pillows. I gathered everything, clothes, toys, books, and packed it into bags. I didn't stop to second-guess myself. If they wanted their things, they could get them back. Just not here. I paused in my own room only briefly. It felt untouched, like a relic of the past in a house that no longer belonged to me. My bedspread was the same faded navy blue one I'd had since high school. The bookshelves were still crammed with old novels and textbooks, and my desk held a few knickknacks I hadn't thought about in years. As much as I hated what the house had become, this room still felt like mine. But it wasn't enough to clear the house of their things. I needed to reclaim it entirely. The next few days were a blur of activity. I worked tirelessly, stripping the house of everything that screamed them. Celeste's decorative vases and framed motivational quotes went straight to the garage. The beige throw rugs she had carefully selected were rolled up and stuffed into the trunk of my car. Even the curtains, which Celeste had replaced with gauzy white panels, were taken down and replaced with the heavy, navy ones my mom had chosen years ago. It wasn't just about removing them. It was about restoring what had been stolen. I dug through the attic, pulling out boxes of my mom's old belongings that had been shoved into storage. Her photos, her quilts, her favorite dishes. Everything I could find was brought back downstairs and placed where it belonged. The process wasn't easy. Every item I unpacked brought with it a wave of memories, some warm, others unbearably painful. But with each box, I felt the house come alive again, like it was finally shaking off the suffocating presence of Celeste and her daughters. Of course, I knew this was only part of the plan. Reclaiming the house was a statement, a way of saying, this is mine, not yours. But I also knew it wouldn't be enough to keep them from coming back. For that, I needed something more permanent. That's when I turned my attention to the paperwork. I had always stayed out of the financial side of things. My father handled the bills, the mortgage, the utilities. I never had a reason to interfere. But now, as I dug through the filing cabinet in his office, I realized how much power those documents held. Bank statements, property records, insurance policies. It was all there, neatly organized in folders labeled in my father's tidy handwriting. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for at first. But as I flipped through the pages, an idea began to form. If I could find a way to gain control of the house, legally, financially, they wouldn't be able to return even if they wanted to. It was a long shot, but I had to try. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. I found copies of the mortgage agreement, detailing the payments my father had been making for years. I found Celeste's name listed on some of the utilities, but not others. And most interestingly, I found a folder containing the original deed to the house, still in my father's name alone. That detail felt like a lifeline. Celeste might have taken over the house in every other sense, but legally, it was still his. And by extension, mine. The question was, how could I use that to my advantage? I spent hours researching online, diving into forums and articles about property rights and family disputes. I learned about legal loopholes, power of attorney, and the ways people could reclaim ownership of a house. The more I read, the more confident I became that this plan could work. It would take time, and it would take precision, but if I played my cards right, I could ensure they had no place here when they returned. As I stood in the now-empty living room, stripped of all traces of Celeste's influence, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a battlefield, and I intended to win. There's something eerie about being alone in a house that once held so much noise, so much life. The silence isn't peaceful. It's oppressive, like the walls themselves are watching, waiting to see what I'll do next. But that didn't bother me. If anything, it gave me clarity. The house was mine now, not just physically, but emotionally. It felt like I had exorcised the ghosts of Celeste and her daughters. The sterile decor, the carefully curated aesthetics, the suffocating air of perfection. They were gone, replaced by something more real, more familiar. My mother's warmth was back in every corner, every shelf, every room. But the work wasn't finished. Not yet. I knew they'd come back eventually. That much was inevitable. And when they did, I couldn't leave anything to chance. They had to find a house so unrecognizable, so hostile to their presence, that stepping through the door would feel like walking into a stranger's home. More importantly, they had to know they had no claim to it anymore. I started with the small things, little subtle changes that would chip away at their sense of belonging. I went through the mail and updated the address for every subscription, every delivery service, every account I could find. Celeste loved her online shopping. Packages arrived at the house almost daily, filled with clothes, gadgets, and other luxuries she didn't need. I redirected all of it to a P.O. box in the next town over. a place I knew she'd never think to check. Next came the utilities. I called the power company, the water company, even the internet provider, and updated the account information. It was surprisingly easy to remove Celeste's name from everything. All it took was a few forms and a firm tone, and suddenly she was no longer tied to the house in any meaningful way. But the biggest challenge was the mortgage. I spent hours poring over the documents I had found in my father's office, trying to piece together how the payments were being managed. It didn't take long to discover that my father had set up automatic transfers from a joint account he shared with Celeste. The account was funded primarily by his paycheck, but Celeste had added her own savings over the years. That gave me an idea. I logged into the online banking portal. My father had written the login details on a sticky note tucked inside the filing cabinet and transferred the balance from the joint account into a separate one under his name alone. Then I called the bank and requested a temporary freeze on the joint account, citing suspicious activity. It was a bold move, and one that would likely cause chaos when they tried to access their money. But that was the point. Once the financial side of things was under control, I turned my attention to the physical structure of the house. Celeste loved her creature comforts, the spa-like bathroom, the high-tech kitchen appliances, the perfectly temperature-controlled air conditioning. I made sure none of it would be waiting for her when she returned. The first thing to go was the thermostat. I ripped it out of the wall, leaving a gaping hole where the sleek digital screen used to be. Then I went to the kitchen and disconnected the fancy, smart oven, replacing it with the old gas stove my mom had used. It was still functional, but it lacked the sleek design and touchpad interface Celeste adored. I didn't stop there. I went through every room, removing anything that felt like it belonged to her. The luxurious bedding in the master bedroom was replaced with my mom's old quilt. The sleek, modern furniture in the living room was swapped out for the mismatched but comfortable pieces we had stored in the attic. Even the bathroom wasn't spared. I replaced the expensive soaps and lotions with the basic, no-frills brands my mom used to buy. By the time I was done, the house looked like a time capsule from my childhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Still, I knew I couldn't rely on aesthetics alone to keep them away. I needed something more concrete, something they couldn't argue with. That's when I remembered the deed. Legally, the house was still in my father's name. Celeste might have lived here, might have acted like it was hers, but she had no legal claim to it. That gave me leverage, and I intended to use it. I called a lawyer the next day, explaining the situation in vague terms. I told him I was concerned about the possibility of disputes over property ownership and wanted to ensure that the house remained under my father's control. The lawyer was thorough, asking questions about my father's financial situation, his relationship with Celeste, and any existing agreements they might have. By the end of the consultation, I had a plan. With the right paperwork, I could establish myself as the executor of my father's estate, granting me temporary authority over his assets in his absence. It was a precautionary measure, the lawyer explained, but it would give me the power to make decisions about the house without their interference. The process was surprisingly straightforward. Within days, I had the necessary documents in hand, ready to be signed and notarized. It felt surreal, like I was taking control of something that had always been just out of reach. As I stood in the now transformed living room, the final pieces of my plan falling into place, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was exhilarated, proud of what I had accomplished. But another part of me felt hollow, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming a sense of self, of dignity, of worth. They had taken so much from me. My place in the family, my sense of belonging, my connection to my father. And now I was taking something back. The question was, when they returned, would they even recognize the house they had left behind? The house was ready. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a statement. Every corner, every room, every tiny detail now reflected me and the life they had tried to erase. And as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, there was a strange quiet in my mind as the day of their return approached. This wasn't just about revenge or reclaiming what was mine. It was about finally drawing a line, one they couldn't cross anymore. The morning of their return was surreal. I woke early, the house eerily calm, bathed in a pale winter light, filtering through the heavy navy curtains I had rehung in the living room. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust, a stark contrast to the suffocating lavender scent that used to cling to every surface. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window, my thoughts heavy but my heart steady. The text came around mid-morning, my father's usual clipped and impersonal tone. Landing this afternoon. See you soon. The words hung on the screen like an unfinished sentence, a promise that everything they'd left behind would be waiting for them. But that promise had been broken long before they packed their bags. I spent the final hours walking through the house one last time, checking every room to make sure it was just right. The master bedroom was stripped of every trace of Celeste's sterile modern decor. The silky beige duvet she had picked out was gone, replaced with my mom's old patchwork quilt, faded but full of life. The walls, once painted an impersonal slate gray, were now adorned with old family photos I had unearthed from the attic. My parents' wedding photo sat prominently on the dresser, a quiet defiance against the woman who had tried to rewrite this house's history. In the living room, the mismatched furniture I'd brought down from storage created an odd but comforting warmth. The coffee table was cluttered with the knickknacks my mom used to love, small porcelain animals, a worn hardcover copy of Pride and Prejudice, and a framed photo of me as a kid, grinning with a missing front tooth. The space no longer screamed perfection. It whispered authenticity. The final room I checked was my own. It felt untouched, a time capsule of who I used to be before everything fell apart. I hesitated at the doorway, scanning the shelves of books, the faded posters on the walls, the desk piled with old notebooks and pens. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far, if maybe there was still a chance for things to go back to how they used to be, or at least something close. But as soon as the thought entered my mind, I pushed it away. This wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward on my own terms. When I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway, my chest tightened. They were here. I stood frozen in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as I listened to the sound of the car doors slamming shut. Footsteps approached the door, followed by the familiar jingle of keys. The door opened, and silence fell. It wasn't the silence of relief or peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of shock. For a moment, they didn't say anything. I could hear the rustle of coats, the soft thud of suitcases being set down. Then the voices began. Low at first, murmured words of confusion that quickly escalated into disbelief. "Where's all our stuff?" Celeste's voice cut through the air, sharp and panicked. I stayed where I was, out of sight, letting them take it all in. I could picture them moving through the house, their carefully curated lives unraveling with every step. Celeste must have noticed the photos first. My mother's smiling face replacing the abstract artwork she had so carefully chosen. Then the furniture, the decor, the unmistakable presence of someone else's life reclaiming the space they had tried to make their own. The twins' voices came next, their confusion more subdued, but no less impactful. I heard Grace ask where her bed was, her voice wavering with a mix of fear and frustration. Lily muttered something about her posters being gone. Their footsteps echoed up the stairs, their disbelief rising as they moved through the house that no longer felt familiar. Then came my father. His voice was steady but sharp, cutting through the chaos with a single word. My name. Daniel. He said it again, louder this time, his tone demanding an explanation. I finally stepped out of the kitchen, my footsteps deliberate, my expression calm. When I saw them standing in the living room, I felt a strange sense of detachment. My father's face was a mix of anger and confusion, his brows furrowed as he scanned the room. Celeste stood beside him, her carefully polished veneer shattered. She looked smaller somehow, her presence diminished in a house that no longer catered to her. The twins hovered near the stairs, their expressions unsure, their usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted them to feel it, the dissonance, the alienation, the creeping realization that they didn't belong here anymore. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice was sharp, accusatory, demanding to know what had happened. But I didn't answer his questions. I didn't owe him answers. Instead, I told him the truth, not just about the house, but about everything. I told him how it felt to be erased, to be pushed aside and forgotten while they built their perfect little family. I told him how I had spent years trying to belong, only to realize that I never really did. And I told him that this house, my house, was no longer theirs. Celeste tried to argue, her voice rising in protest, but it was a futile effort. I had taken every precaution, made sure they had no legal claim to this place. Her words fell flat, empty and meaningless in the face of what I had done. My father didn't argue. He just stood there, his shoulders slumping as the weight of it all settled on him. For the first time, he looked old, tired, like a man who had lost more than he realized. One by one, they left. My father was the first to walk out the door, his steps heavy, his silence deafening. Celeste followed reluctantly, casting one last, desperate glance around the living room before stepping outside. The twins lingered for a moment, their confusion etched on their faces, but eventually, they too disappeared down the driveway. I watched from the window as their car backed out and disappeared down the street. The house was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't an oppressive silence. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, the house felt like home. I don't know if they'll try to come back. Maybe they'll fight for what they think they're entitled to. Or maybe they'll accept that this chapter of their lives is over. Either way, it doesn't matter. I've reclaimed what they took from me, and in doing so, I've reclaimed myself. This isn't just a house anymore. It's a symbol of everything I've endured, everything I've fought for. And as I stood in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the curtains my mom had chosen all those years ago, I finally felt free.